Hi, welcome to the session, The Actual Status of the European Copyright Reform and the Digital Single Market. Where are the virtual bridges? So the European Commission firstly announced the Digital Single Market Strategy in May 2015. Since then we have seen that the digital single market is gradually taking shape. The aim of this digital single market is to create an internet without barriers throughout the whole European Union, and the Commission is particularly focused in reforming and modernizing the European copyright law. We have three wonderful speakers today that will build some bridges for us in order to understand the European copyright reform. The first one is Mrs. Vita Jugne. She is a policy officer currently working in the copyright unit of the DG Connect of the European Commission. Vitka works on priority projects of the European Commission, including the regulation on cross-border portability of online content services, the proposal for a regulation aiming to facilitate cross-border access to TV and radio programs online, as well as the proposed copyright exceptions. Our second speaker is Mr. Sebastian Schwemmer. He is a researcher at the Center for Information and Innovation Law, University of Copenhagen, Denmark. Sebastian holds a PhD from the University of Copenhagen and also several degrees in law, economics and management. He's very passionate in talking about technology and social aspects. And our third speaker is Mrs. Aniko Grad-Genge. She's a professor at the Karoli Gaspar University and a legal advisor at ProArt Hungarian Copyright Alliance. So I will let Vita building the first bridge for us.
Thank you very much, Delia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here with you today in the beautiful city of Budapest. Each time I'm here in Budapest, they are full of nice surprises, and today my very big surprise, I'm very happy to address you, ACTA members who are interested in copyright. This is a big privilege for me to be here. And as Delia and a bit thematics of today's and of these few days in ACTA conference is about building bridges. So actually will contribute to, hopefully, to building a bridge between you and Brussels, because in Brussels, in terms of copyright, there are lots of things going on, because the Commission has tabled a package of ambitious reform in order to modernize copyright rules, and I'm going to tell you what is there in that package and what challenges we are facing in the negotiation, because they're really now going very, very intensively. You see little notice in the slides that I'm speaking in personal capacities. When I'm giving views, they're my views. I cannot bind my employer, the European Commission, so make the usual disclaimer for that, with that regard. So a bit about the background, why the copyright reform and why now? It is how it started. So it has started as one of top 10 priorities of Juncker Commission. And it was announced in Digital Single Market Strategy in May 2015, outlining that there is a need to address the EU copyright framework and to remove key obstacles for the functioning of digital single market. So it is meant to be targeted action. It's not like overhaul of copyright system. It's not going overly ambitiously to create a uniform copyright title or to shake the markets as they are. It is more like looking very targetedly to the issues which are core to the digital single market today, focusing on digital and cross-border aspects. So that was explained in Commission communication, a bit like setting the framework. And the first proposal with which we started, and as Delia already mentioned, I worked with it myself, was proposal for regulation on cross-border portability of online content services. The proposal was tabled in December 2015, and I'm happy to say that in that time which passed, this regulation has been negotiated and adopted, and normally it was supposed to be published today at the official journal. I haven't checked, but normally it should be there, and it means that 9 months from that date when it is published, it will come into force. So before going into other instruments, I'll tell you a couple of words about this proposal. Because what is there? What is this content portability? We spoke a lot, and we're still speaking a lot about end of roaming. And it was seen that it would be a bit illogical that EU consumers can travel freely in Europe with their mobile subscriptions, but and they would be free to roam, also to use internet services, but they would not get possibility to continue watching or listening or somehow otherwise using content to which they subscribed in their member state of residence and for which they're paying. So that first instrument actually is removing the obstacles and enabling consumers to continue to have access to that content and obliging service providers to do that. So as I mentioned, that those providers who take money from consumers, they will be obliged to do that. And service providers who give services free of charge, they will have option to opt in and benefit from the mechanism of the regulation. How it is being achieved, I know that Sebastian will tell us about it more, so I'm just like going to the very, very core. It is being achieved by legal fiction, which says that when consumer is using and accessing to that online content service, being temporary abroad in EU, it is considered that service is being used and accessed still in his or her member state. Thanks to that legal fiction, there is no need for service providers to get licenses in other countries, because it is assumed that the service is still being consumed in consumer's member state. And what I would like to underline, and this is very interesting in my view, it is not just copyright legal fiction. It applies for all purposes except taxes. So let's imagine if there is some regulation about hate speech or protection of minors, or there are some specific time slots when in certain member states it is prohibited to show football on Sundays on TV because it is expected that people would go more to the stadium. Those restrictions do not apply in all countries. Everything is applicable as if consumer were using services in his or her member state. And here, attention, there is no absurd interpretation. The consumer is not considered to be in his or her member state, only the service is considered to be used in that member state. So that legal fiction helps that there is no need then for service providers to take care what are legal requirements in other countries, what shall I do? It's basically service provider just needs to remove geo-blocking and to allow consumer enjoy the service. On the other hand, in order not to make it outrageously expensive for service providers, there is no obligation to ensure a level of quality. Because we know that service providers, they establish a network in order to achieve higher speed, higher quality for consumers in their country. To impose that obligation to do it everywhere in Europe would be a burden which would be unsupportable for SMEs and even for bigger players. So there is no burden to do quality unless the service provider promised to consumers. So in our view, there would be benefits obviously to consumers because they will be able to benefit from the service, but also for service providers who need to forget differences in the EU legal framework and don't need to get licenses. Plus, for right holders, also it creates a safe instrument because they have some protection of their rights, because the regulation also establishes verification mechanism of consumer member state of residence to avoid abuses of the instrument, so to put it. So, and now move on after having introduced this instrument to the rest of the package. So after this portability proposal, next step was done in September last year, and Commission tabled 4 legal instruments. So one regulation on online transmissions and retransmissions of TV radio services, directive on copyright and digital silver market, and 2 instruments to implement the Marrakesh Treaty, which gives special copyright exception in favor of visually impaired people. And here I'm also having good news because on 10 of May, this Marrakesh 2 instruments have been agreed politically by Parliament and the Council, so there's already agreed text, and these 2 instruments also in the process of being adopted. So I'll a bit focus on the rest. So for this second copyright package, what were objectives? So globally, there was objective to give to consumers better choice and access to content online across borders, but doing that gently. So without obliging service providers, shaking the market, removing geo-blocking because the markets might not be yet ready, but more like through enabling mechanisms. Second block of rules concern exceptions, and they will create mandatory copyright exceptions, which are most crucial for digital single market, and which will replace existing national copyright exceptions in 3 areas. So that is teaching, text and data mining, and preservation. In addition, I already mentioned special exception for visually impaired people. And third chapter of the reform is to create a fairer and sustainable marketplace for creators and press to face digital challenges. Now I'll a bit step in deeper into a couple of these topics. So first, let me a bit speak about the regulation, TV, radio, online, which is sometimes often actually referred as SAT, CAP, or satellite and cable regulation, because since 1993 there was instrumented directive which helped cross-border transmission of TVs and radios through satellite and cable technologies. And this new proposal, it concerns new technologies, but uses the same principles and the same instruments which are already existing since 1993. And what are the issues there? The problem in broadcasting market is complexity of right clearance. Just to give an example, a broadcaster makes a TV series itself. So in one episode of TV series, there could be up to 100 rights of other right holders, like music, scenario, like offer of text, etc., picture on the wall. Documentary could be about 30 rights. And big broadcaster would conclude as many as about 100,000 of contracts a year. And plus they have big speed to do for most of their productions, because news come to air a couple of minutes after being prepared, say some game shows, etc., a couple of days, so the speed is enormous. And their broadcaster, they could for some things, put things online, etc., but they face enormous transaction burden if they want to clear those rights not only for their own member state, but also for cross borders. So because of this massive transaction costs and burden, and for some broadcasters who are commercial, there is also no commercial interest to invest into that. There is quite a lot of job blocking ongoing, and not only for premium content such as films and sporting events, but also travel shows, cultural programs, talks, even political debates. And there the Commission felt that something could be done by creating enabling mechanism, which would again for TV and radio transmissions online would create a legal fiction, which is called country of origin. Once broadcaster clears the rights for its own country, then broadcaster can be assumed when they transmit this TV and radio program online that everything is happening in broadcaster's country of establishment. But here also freedom of contracts is very much respected, because the proposed regulation says, but nevertheless broadcasters and right holders can agree on the territorial limitation of transmissions, because otherwise not all broadcasters would be able to acquire and to pay for licenses which would really de facto cover transmissions in all Europe. So the idea is to help broadcasters so that they don't need to run and clear rights in 28 member states, but still the price which they pay for right holders need to take into account the real audience where they will show that program, and plus there is neither obligation or removal of any possibility still to limit services to particular country. And in the same instrument, there is also proposal to facilitate retransmissions of TV and radio programs from other member states. So, for example, when we have like satellite, cable, etc. packages, through mandatory collective management of rights. So here, like globally, all ideas to help the landscape to make it more easy and to foster and to create incentives for cross-border access to TV and radio programs. I very briefly move to other chapters of the directive. Is to say that also the directive would help cultural heritage institutions to digitalize and make available their works if their collections, if works are out of commerce and they cannot get hold of right holders. Also, the new copyright exceptions would make easier for teaching activities online across borders, because again there is the legal fiction proposed, as well as it would create a new exception for text and data mining for research organizations. They would be beneficiaries, research organizations, so they can do necessary copying and which is needed in order to mine big quantities of data, in order to, for example, to find common trends, some patterns, etc., and to do like successful research in Europe. As well as there is a special proposed exception for preservation to make copies for preservation purposes for such entities like libraries, museums, and the like. I'll briefly touch the last chapter of the proposed directive, which aims to create fairer market conditions for creators and press in the digital world. And it has a few mechanisms, and one of them is to create a framework for platforms which use large amounts of content uploaded by users. So you immediately can think of some examples such as YouTube or alike type of platforms, to cooperate with right holders and to include proportionate and appropriate measures if right holders are not happy to see their content there. So they should be able to ask it to be removed, and to have mechanisms how they cooperate with platforms. Plus, that is a bit also what is new in that directive. It suggests to create a special new related right to news publishers for digital uses of their publication, so that they could better defend their rights online alongside with authors in a similar manner as, for example, have producers or record companies. So that is new right. And for authors and performers, it also has benefits because it will increase transparency as concerns remuneration, how their works are being used, and even also a mechanism that if there is like a big disparity between the agreed fee and what was expected use of work and what is the real use of work, so that would be possibility to launch adjustment mechanism to review the fee for the benefit of authors and performers. So very quickly concluding, this was what was tabled as proposals. Now the negotiations are at the level of the Council and the Parliament. I can say the reform is highly debated, highly sentimental. It shows like even though the cultural sectors in the EU, they amount to about 4% of GDP, but the level of emotions and interest to this field is like really super high. And the most debated areas are the regulation, which I mentioned about TV and radio programs, as well as value gap, which you mentioned about platforms, publishers, and also text and data mining, because there are discussions who should be beneficiaries. Is it enough to give this exception to research organizations, or as some groups in the parliament want to see a wider circle of beneficiaries? So actually the debate is ongoing, so we still need to follow and to see what would be the landing space. I'm sure there would be need to look for compromises. And what is striking and interesting in this debate that sometimes even in the same political group, there are divisions and different opinions. For example, see, part of Social Democrats would be very pro-red holders, the other part would be very pro-users. So like debate is like very, and we're still shaping and waiting what would be the landing space. So this concludes my presentation, and very grateful for your attention, and we will take your questions when time comes.
Presentation. I invite Sebastian to give us an insight, especially on cross-border portability of online content services.
Thank you very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now it's my pleasure for the next approximately 20 minutes to take you on a little journey on, as Delia called it, the Internet without borders as relates to music and audiovisual content. So, how did we get here and where are we at? My name is Sebastian Schwiemer. I'm an industrial researcher at the University of Copenhagen Center for Information and Innovation Law. I'm also a researcher at the Danish Internet Forum, the Danish top-level domain administrator. And outside academia, I've been working a lot with technology startups. I've been one of the people involved in Tech Festival in Copenhagen for one Danish grassroots initiative. So let me briefly touch upon the problem. When I was traveling last year to Iceland, I saw this on my board entertainment screen. It reads something like, due to the significant changes in the licensing landscape, we can't offer you an onboard music selection at this time. Or when I try to access my Danish streaming service here in the hotel, I would get a picture like, content is blocked, you have to be in Denmark to see your content. And actually this is the case for 77% roughly of subscription-based services still. For the public broadcaster, it doesn't look much better. If I try to access the German public broadcaster in Denmark, I would usually get a geo-blocking message. Or maybe some of you have heard of the very famous Norwegian TV series Skam, Shame. There was a huge debate on their geo-blocking outside Norway more recently. And this is the case for almost 82% of publicly funded models. At the same time, as you all know, if we consume music, for example, nowadays, we do that via streaming. In Denmark in 2015, 72% of all music revenues stemmed from streaming. And in Norway, even as much as 81% in the same period. So where does this lead us? On the one side, we have the demand for ubiquitous access to content on the internet, whether that's cross-border or whether that's portable, whether that's full repertoire. And on the other hand, we have 28 member states and copyright's territorial nature. I'm not so much talking about the Berne Convention, Article 5, Paragraph 2, but rather the territorial exploitation practice we have seen. So how do we reconcile that? If I may take you back for a second, if we think about online content services, there's two ways of addressing this issue. One is in the upstream relation, the licensing relation between right holders and the online content service. That could be via intermediaries, collective management organizations, or directly. And the second relation would be the downstream relation, the access relation, where we address the direct relation between the consumer and the online content service. And these two will guide kind of my presentation. So licensing on the one side of the coin and access on the other. Now, if we think about access, I also, oops, this was too fast. I also want to differentiate two situations with you. If we think about a member state offered in online content service offered in member state A, we have two situations. In member state B, there might be a consumer from member state A temporarily, that's the portability that we just heard about. And the second scenario would be that a consumer from member state B, so from another country, tries to access the member state A's online content service without being somewhere else temporarily, but just being in his home country. And I think one neat way of thinking about that is this first scenario of portability somehow relates to the free movement of the consumer, because actually the consumer moving to another place. Whereas the second scenario really relates to the free movement of the content service. And I think those two scenarios are very different to differentiate when we look at what the solutions are at this time. The second differentiation or delineation I want to talk about is competition and legislation. On the one side, we have ex post control by competition rules that could be the competition authorities or the court. On the other side, we have the legislation, the institutional legal framework. And those are very important to differentiate in my eyes because there is actually a supporting effect, and we have seen different ways going there. And if we look at some of the measures taken or some of the aspects relevant, we have a small timeline here. Above you see everything related to music, below you see everything related to audiovisual. So in the music sphere, standard contracts by CSAC, for example, have been industry standards for a very long time, led to competition proceedings that I'm going to talk about in a second. The recommendation of 2005, a soft law tool, has been adopted, then finally leading to Directive 2014-26 of the EU on collective management and multi-territorial licensing and merger proceedings. Whereas on the access side of things, on the audiovisual side of things, we have seen many consultations. Obviously, the licensing agreements in the terms of the service providers nowadays play a crucial role. The Court of Justice, notably in Premier League and Murphy, and I'm going to touch a little on that, has addressed some of the issues, even though it's not about streaming. The investigation into pay TV services based on the Premier League and Murphy case. And then the three mentioned proposals, the portability regulation, the geo-blocking regulation, and the broadcasting or auxiliary online services regulation. Now we think back about the differentiation of competition and legislation. Let's briefly look at the two strands of conduct relevant from a competition point of view. The first one is the licensor relationship, so two licensors and their relationship, where mainly model contracts and the territorial restrictions in those contractual arrangements have been key. So this roughly correlates to horizontal agreements. And the second relation, the licensor-licensee relationship, on the other hand, where the licensing arrangements and licensing agreements in the audiovisual sector more have been in the focus in terms of the territorial delineation. Let me take you on a short journey back. The licensor-licensor relationship in music. Traditionally, collective management organizations have licensed the rights of right holders in territory A in their own country from the right holders there. But as we already heard, music are complex works and there's many different right holders involved, often from other countries. So there also had to be a solution of how you could license the rights from right holder B from territory B. And that was dealt with in form of reciprocal representation agreements. I'm sure some of you have heard of them before. It's agreements between two CMOs saying, we represent your rights, you present our rights, and then we have can license a full repertoire. This has been very problematic from a competition point of view. There has been case law dating back to Lucas Tournier, CISA cases, Stim versus Commission, the other Commission cases, etc. If you flip sides to the licensor-licensee relation, I want to draw your attention to the 2011 judgment of the Court of Justice in Premier League and Murphy. And the Premier League and Murphy case obviously hasn't been about streaming. It has been about a ban on sales of decoder devices, about an additional contract rationale. But nonetheless, it's interesting to put this into the context of streaming. Here the court held that right holders are not as such prohibited to delineate markets geographically, but this additional contractual obligation rationale, that was problematic. And this really somehow correlates to the general principle of passive sales or unsolicited requests in competition law. In 2014, the European Commission opened pay TV antitrust proceedings based on the Premier League and Murphy case. And the interesting thing here is it actually concerns the direct access by consumers to the service. I think the major importance of the antitrust proceedings here is really that it implies that the findings of Premier League and Murphy are applicable beyond broadcast and football matches, exploring really the outer boundaries. In 2016, Paramount offered to cease its geo-blocking practice, which was argued to constitute absolute territorial exclusivity, and the commitments were accepted. However, there's some follow-ups, which I don't have too many insights on. We might discuss that later Let's switch sides to the legislative angle. So now we've looked at the competition side of things. Now we move to the legislation ex ante regulation. And there's really two things. One, we have seen addressed the multi-territorial licensing, so licensing by collective management organizations. And we've seen cross-border access. And for the first one, for the multi-territorial licensing, there really has been a shift from the voluntary to the binding measures, or maybe it's just voluntary after all, also in the Directive 2014. And that looks a little like the following. Traditionally, if you think about licensing, a collective management organization would have, based on those model contracts that I mentioned before, licensed monoterritorial, so just in the country the collective management organization operates, but multi-repertoire, so all of the different repertoires. And the basis really has been self-regulation and national rules here. And then in 2004, 2005, we saw the emergence of a new licensing form, customized licensing entities, inspired or at least in connection to be seen with the recommendation of 2005, the soft law tool, the online music recommendation, and the CSEC decision. And those licensing entities then started to license multi-territorial, so that's good for multi-territorial access and cross-border access, etc. But mono-repertoire, so only for one repertoire. And this really finds its basis in the soft and case law. And then the latest edition are so-called licensing hubs, and some other forms maybe as well, inspired by Directive 2014-26 of the EU, which promote a system of multi-territorial, multi-repertoire licensing hubs. And here really, this is the codification and EU legislation angle. And this mechanism is interesting to look at because it works in two ways. So what is in place is a European licensing passport. Some of you that might have worked with banking regulation or similar passport model has been used in other contexts as well. For author collective management organizations, so it's a very small aspect we're looking at here, which really is aimed at encouraging the re-aggregation on a voluntary basis of repertoire, so make it easier to license, and thereby reduce the transaction costs in the licensing process and ultimately make it more accessible. And there are two main legal aspects or legal tools of that, and I think there's one, Article 24 of the directive, which addresses the capacity to process multi-territorial licenses, and Article 30 that sets out for take-on obligations and take-on opportunities for those that do or do not comply. So really here the incentives are twofold, right? We have on the one side market forces, and on the other side compliance costs that should lead to a few licensing hubs that make licensing easier. And we're going to hear more about the CRM directive afterwards as well. Now let me briefly cover the cross-border access side of things from a legislative point of view. Vita already talked about the portability proposal, there's the geo-blocking proposal and the broadcasting proposal of 2016. I just briefly want to dig into the portability proposal because I think it's a very interesting model that has been chosen there. It's a fairly sleek and simple mechanism. So in the portability regulation, online content service that is offered for subscription has to provide access to its content, according to Article 3, Paragraph 1, to consumers that are temporarily in a different member state. So this is the situation where we have a consumer temporarily going to another member state. It's not the service that's moving across borders, it's the consumer moving across borders. And the legal fiction in Article 4 really enables this with the country of origin principle, that this access is to deemed occur solely in the member state of the consumer's residence. So thereby the licensing situation is clear, but still there might be contractual arrangements that go against the scope of the regulation. In Article 5, then contractual provisions are deemed unenforceable if they go against the regulation. Now I want to conclude with some thoughts and remarks. If we think about what is the regulatory framework for licensing right now, and licensing really the flip side to this is access to online music and audiovisual content in the cross-border situations. And what are the different regulatory frameworks, how do they interact, what are inconsistencies? So for the characteristics, first of all, I think it's fair to say that this is still a fairly complex regime. There are differences depending both on the subject matter and the institutional arrangement. So it's different whether we look at music or audiovisual content. The territoriality issues are addressed actually at different levels of the exploitation chain as well. Music, there we have mainly seen addressed the territorial exploitation per intermediaries, whereas audiovisual, there the territorial exclusive licenses have been in the focus. And whereas for multi-territorial licensing, we have seen that mitigating transaction costs is the chosen means to increase access. Cross-border access actually has been a little more ambitious because we see regulations which we haven't seen in the copyright-related sphere before, but at the same time also less ambitious because they're very restricted in its scope. So if we think back about the licensor relationship, collective management organizations, over the last 15 years regarding online cross-border multi-territorial access, I think it's fair to say that territorial restrictions by CMOs have had to be reviewed. In this context, it's also interesting to reflect about the collectivization as a whole and the economic efficiency rationale which stands behind, because that's really eroding in the digital landscape. Both the regulation by the competition authorities and the regulation by legislation are fairly consistent into their choosing of having competition between CMOs over repertoire as the most efficient mean. And the directive, the news tool adopted, really promotes an oligopolistic structure that wants to make the licensing simpler. At the same time, right now, there's mostly a horizontal aggregation of functions that I think we're seeing, and just some re-aggregation of rights. If we look at the regulation of cross-border access on the other side, I think the portability regulation really is an intriguing model, because it solves so many of the, addresses all the different aspects. When we talk about true cross-border access, and here I mean the situation where we actually have the service being accessed, moving across borders, not us temporarily as citizens, it's a little more problematic. It has been exempt from the proposal of the geo-blocking regulation. Later on, the European Parliament actually had some amendments here, so it's not really addressed in the legislative framework. And here I think an intriguing play of thought opens up when thinking about Premier League and Murphy and the pay TV investigation. Because we have this broad application of a passive sale rationale. Actually, this might facilitate some cross-border access. The catch, however, is service providers will not be obliged to respond to passive sales. So there might be a drawback there. Now, very briefly, on the interplay of competition law and legislative intervention. I think what we can notice is that competition law has been used to an increasing part to ensure access to copyright-protected works. And I also would argue that this, to some degree, is maybe not well-tuned, but at least at some point intended interplay between those two means. And I want to conclude by mentioning two aspects, and I think one is really competition law is taking back some of the autonomy that copyright-protected subject matter had in the offline world. And I also think it's important to recognize this shift in copyright, that we're suddenly talking about consumers and access, because the consumer hasn't really been on the radar of copyright so much before. And what does it mean, for example, for limiting contractual freedom? And finally, I think all the measures are just bricks that are very complicated in its interplay. However, all those measures must address and solve not only the underlying licensing issue, but also address the access dimension. And that's even more important in an age where content is mostly accessed by subscription services, where largely contractual arrangements govern our access to that. With that, I want to thank you for your attention and look forward to discussing this afterwards.
Much, Sebastian. I reserve myself 1 or 2 questions for the question session. I invite Aniko. She will present some interesting aspects regarding a more European collective management of copyright.
Thank you, Delia. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity to give this presentation today at this excellent conference. It's a privilege for me. I've been asked to talk about the reform of the collective rights management of copyright in Hungary, but before this I would like to make some preliminary remarks. First of all, I've never worked for a collective rights management organization except for my training period during the university years, but that was at the dawn of the collective rights management. Moreover, when I was a young PhD candidate, my doctor father dissuaded me from writing my dissertation on collective rights management, saying that this phenomenon is not really a scientific topic, it's rather a practice driven by business interests, and there is little theoretical beauty in it. Moreover, it's a revolutionary area both in Hungary and at the EU level, and only a snapshot can be taken of it at most. As a last introductory remark, I must mention that I often interpret the rules of the rights management system to outsiders, who are mainly the users and the beneficiaries of copyright exceptions. It means that in my 20 minutes or in my 18 minutes, I will try to do my best to discuss the Hungarian rights management system in an interesting way for this distinguished audience. Since the importance of the mass use of copyright-protected works was recognized at all, the collective rights management has become an outstanding institution of the practice of copyright. In Hungary, the court cases like the famous case of the composer Ernst Bourget versus the Café Ambassadeur in Paris have paved the way for the establishment of the rights management. The history started with the Association of the Authors in Hungary too, more than 100 years ago. The first organization exercised the right of the authors to the public performance was called Mars and began its activities in the territory of Hungary as an affiliate of the Austrian AKM. After the First World War, the Trianon Peace Treaty resulted not just in the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, but also in the creation of a territorially independent collective rights management. Until the time of the Second World War, a number of similar organizations were established, which exercised various rights of the authors, and the foreign users were licensed via mutual representation agreements with similar foreign organizations. After the communist takeover, the activities of these civil organizations were ended by the nationalization carried out in 1953. In Hungary, the nationalization had a much deeper impact even compared to the other communist countries in the region, affecting all the areas of the copyright industries. Nevertheless, exercise of the rights had yet to be enabled, so as a result of the nationalization, the National Copyright Office was founded, whose activities was characterized by a less author-friendly attitude, which in some cases was pure censorship. For instance, each individual license granted from Hungary to a foreign user had to be approved by the office. At any rate, by establishing the office, the first one-stop shop was created in the history of the Hungarian collective rights management, as every right of each right holder could be acquired through the office as a CMO. Moreover, the amount of the remuneration or the royalties were also harmonized and transparent, as they were set by law, usually by ministerial decrees. Following the change of the political system in 1989, largely due to the fact that Hungary wished to join the EU, as part of the transition toward market economy, the Copyright Office was closed and the rights could be exercised by the right holders and their organizations again. As a stage in this process, non-profit associations were established by the right holders for the purpose of collective rights management. These organizations acted for the benefit of the right holders, doing cultural and social activities too. So as to keep it functional, privatization didn't bring clear market conditions. It didn't provide it for the competition of organizations. As for the licensing of a particular right of a particular group of the right holders, the law enabled to create only one rights management organization, so creating a legal monopoly in this area. The principle of extended rights management was introduced both to maintain the functionality and to grant rights effectively, which made it possible for these private associations to grant licenses with as wide a scope as Copyright Office could grant it earlier. According to the extended licensing, to the principle of ECL, the registered collective rights management organizations could license the whole world repertoire and not only the repertoire of their members. To keep the control of the state, the CMOs had to be registered, and by the fact that the approval of the cultural minister was necessary for the tariffs, practically a controlled market operation was aimed to be achieved. In the past 10 years, the only changes that are worth mentioning have been triggered by the steps of the European Union. First of all, the European Commission launched an infringement procedure against Hungary in 2000, stating that the legal monopoly of the CMOs infringes the EU fundamental principles, namely the free movement of services and the free movement of free settlement. The procedure wasn't concluded by a sanction, but Hungary abolished the legal monopoly of the CMOs in 2011 and practically enabled competition in the market of CMOs, although by setting up very strict requirements. The EC recommendation on CMOs in the field of licensing digital music also played an important role on the way to the present system. It greatly contributed to the reshaping of the business models of licensing in several areas, although it wasn't an obligatory legislative tool. Partly as a result of this, the Hungarian CMOs also participate in the creation of new pan-European systems of licensing. And finally, the CISA case of the CGEU made an important impact, especially in accelerating the renewal of licensing in several areas. Yet the adoption of the CMO directive brings significant changes into the Hungarian collective rights management. In line with this, although not so enthusiastically, the Hungarian legislature continues the liberalization, which was started by eliminating the legal monopoly of the CMOs. The new rules made it clear that it's possible for the CMOs to grant licenses to the territory of Hungary from other countries of the EU, which is guaranteed by the system of a new mutual recognition. Moreover, it has become possible to fund so-called independent rights management organizations. I will discuss them in detail later. Collective rights management organizations that appear in Hungary may also become diversified, as registration doesn't automatically grant extended licensing power. This can only be requested by representative collective rights management organizations. While implementing the directive, the legislature aimed to preserve some solutions of the former system to keep the sustainability and the functionality. This way, associations may continue to become CMO, which means that they continue to work as non-profit organizations. The law preserves the principle of extended licensing, where it's justified and necessary. The state approval of the tariffs has also been preserved, and the state supervision of the organizations exercised by the Hungarian Intellectual Property Office has not been changed significantly. The legislature intended to preserve the non-profit character of the collective rights management system which could be achieved in case of the CMOs registered in Hungary. Both the independent rights management organizations and those who provide services from abroad to Hungary are free to choose the form of their organization. Moreover, foreign license providers into Hungary may even choose a form of organization unknown in the Hungarian company law. At any rate, it can be stated that there are mainly associations in the field of rights management with a wide range of cultural and social activities, and they have no primary business activity. The advantage of this type of organization is that it guarantees a one vote, one person system, decision-making, where each right holder has equal right to participate, thus maintaining the role of solidarity in the system. The principle of extended rights management is a benefit of collective rights management that has a special importance in the digital online world. I can firmly state this, even though the Court of Justice of the EU launched a serious attack against this legal institution in the Solly and Don case. However, a number of studies and the Commission came to the conclusion that the solution, that the extended licensing as the solution to the most crucial copyright issues must be solved here in the extended licensing. Earlier, the Copyright Act granted each registered collective rights management organization the right to extended licensing, which hasn't been changed even by the abolition of the legal monopoly in 2011. It would only have prescribed a close cooperation for the potentially competing parties. Extended licensing grants full safety for the right holders and to the users alike, but it also imposes extraordinary responsibility on the CMOs. Therefore, the law prescribes that only representative CMOs are entitled to giving extended licenses. Remuneration rights without licensing, as they can only be exercised through ECL, may exclusively be exercised by the representative CMOs. The state approval of tariffs must also be mentioned here, which certainly applies only to the CMOs registered in Hungary, but independent CMOs, independent rights management organizations, they are not collective management organizations, only have to announce their tariffs. The approval of the tariffs of CMOs is a very long procedure involving many participants by the guidance of the Hungarian Intellectual Property Office and the Ministry of Justice. And the major users can also have their say in it. If it's still not enough for CMOs to set proper tariffs, these tariffs as general terms and conditions can be litigated at civil law courts, and the minister's decision of approval can also be litigated. Recently, the general supervising power of the Hungarian Competition Authority has also been mentioned. The state supervision of collective rights management has been around since the state has become responsible for collective rights management in Hungary. The supervision has been changed many times since 1996, but it was mainly the supervising organization that has changed, and not the means or the system of the sanctions were amended. The system of supervision had to be thought over too when the directive was implemented, but eventually it hasn't brought about any changes in merit apart from the rise in the supervision fees. Although the circle of the supervised organizations has extended, as the independent CMOs and the foreign organizations issuing licenses in Hungary are also obliged to announce themselves, and the Hungarian Intellectual Property Office is bound to check whether their activities are in accordance with the Hungarian copyright rules. Finally, a new type of organization, which is defined as independent rights management organization, must be mentioned. They can be considered as a preliminary phases of a future CMO, but it's more realistic to assume that independent rights management organizations are not established to undertake all the tasks of the collective rights management in the future. On the contrary, to free themselves from the obligations of collective rights management. Certainly, it also has its price. They cannot exercise remuneration rights, and they are not allowed to conduct activities by extended licensing. Nevertheless, it doesn't have any value concerning each right. Where a great percentage of the right holders is known, they are available, they are members of the organization, only little economic profit can be expected from the extended licensing power. These organizations only announce their establishment at the Hungarian Intellectual Property Office, and the office will not investigate their compliance with the copyright rules in advance. Therefore, the possible problems they cause on the market and which of these problems can be solved can only be identified ex post. In the case of independent rights management organizations, no organizational requirements are prescribed by the law, so they can be established as any legal entity, and as a result, as economic organizations, their activities will not necessarily serve the interests of the right holders primarily. Their tariffs are not subject to an annual approval procedure as the tariffs of the CMOs, which may also influence the effective operation of the market. Although the legislation aimed to bring everyone who is concerned with rights management under the umbrella of the collective rights management law and to make the market more transparent, however, at the moment, the appearance of these organizations seems to lead into the opposite direction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aniko. We are passing now to the question session. So please, when you are addressing a question, say your name, country, and the person to whom you are addressing the question. Please.
Hello, my name is Christian Freudenberg. I'm the chair of the ACTA Copyright Committee, and I have a question for Rita. You already mentioned that there is a lively discussion on the actual proposal package, and I would like to know if you already have an idea regarding Article 11, the press publishers' rights, which is, I think, one of the subjects most lively discussed and with many lobby influence. And is it more likely that it's going to be adopted as it is, or do you have an idea if there are many substantial changes, or if it's even be rejected and deleted in the end? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, Article 11, which would create, the proposed Article 11 would create a new related right to press publishers for digital uses of their works online. And as you mentioned, and as you correctly summarized, it is highly debated, this topic. There are a number of issues. We, the Commission, stand firmly by this proposal. We believe that there is a need to improve their bargaining position, improve their licensing abilities in the online world. We attached to the European press. We see that there are lots of small players, which there is a risk they can be distinguished if they don't get sources of income, etc. So we firmly believe that something needs to be done, and that the proposal which is tabled is a correct approach, because that proposal which is tabled by the Commission, by creating to them a related right, addresses two things. From one hand, it will help them, but not oblige, to have a better bargaining position in licensing of their rights. On the other hand, it would also help them to defend their rights at courts without the need, as today, to demonstrate by contracts of all offers that they have relevant rights in say, hundreds, thousands of press articles. So this is like Commission proposal. And what is happening indeed, especially it is transparent in the Parliament, that there are, I would say, like three in general camps. Some MEPs and some forces support this idea. They think that it's a good way forward. But there are others who, in opposition, suggest deleting the article. And there is a way in between. There are some members of parliament who suggest that press publishers should only have a legal presumption of their right to represent the authors at courts. So it's like in a way to help them for enforcement, but not to help them for the licensing. And there is still discussion ongoing. It's still too early to see what is the landing space, what would be the landing space, because the lead committee, which is for this article, Yuri in the European Parliament, also seen like a change of rapporteur. Now there is new rapporteur, Mr. Voss, who, to my understanding, but it's my personal and preliminary understanding, is in favor of helping European publishers. So that is really, really too early to say what would happen. But what I wanted to say to you, that there are indeed three, elements, three proposals on the table, like keeping as it is, helping only for enforcement, or like deleting the article, and it's still too early to say what would be the final landing space, because also the voting could be very narrow. So that we need to wait until autumn, I suppose, at least, from the European Parliament side.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Fabio Angelini. I'm the Vice Chair of the ACTA Copyright Committee. And I have another question, because this is something that concerns us as ACTA. So as you know, Article 11.1 on data mining says that there will be an exception for research organizations in order to carry out tax and data mining. Now, the problem is that Article 2.1 of the proposal defines research organizations such as university, a research institute, or any other organization, the primary goal of which is to conduct scientific research or to conduct scientific researches and provide educational services. So, it's ACTA. In your opinion, and the opinion of the Commission, fits into this? We don't think so. And yet, we think that we are not a for-profit organization. As ACTA, there is IPPI, there is Marx, there is ANTI, there are a lot of organizations, there are a lot of institutions up there that will not fit into this definition. And we don't understand why we would be discriminated because of these particular kind of definitions. So we are a little bit concerned about this, and we would like to understand also what can we do in order to have our voice and the voice of thousands, literally thousands, of professionals in Europe and outside Europe. How can we make our voice being heard by you? Because today we are lucky that you're here, so we can do it. But if you hadn't been here, we could have been able to make this kind of request. So what do you think?
Thank you very much for the question, and actually good to address me on that, because TDM is one of the topics I cover myself personally, so I'm very pleased to exchange with you. Just a bit globally framework, when the Commission or legislator proposes an exception, there is a need to have in mind in particular two core objects. Two core elements. What objective the legislator wants to achieve, and is there market failure? Is there anything to remedy there in the market? So here the objective which the Commission wanted to achieve by the exception which was tabled is to help to promote the European research activities, European research. In the EU framework, research is understood as done by universities, institutes, educational establishments. So in that context, it was proposed by the Commission in the proposal. And secondly, it was also found out in our impact assessment that there is a functioning licensing market. Publishers offer licenses for TDM purposes, and also there are activities which are done on open internet which do not require licenses as well, for various reasons. For example, either there are acts of only temporary transient reproduction, etc. So basically it was looked at there is a very concrete objective to help research, and that universities do struggle, but in general there is also functioning licensing market, and other actors could rely on that. And no, the exception was shaped indeed in such a way that I'm afraid to confirm your sad self-assessment that ACTA would not be covered by that exception as it is proposed by the Commission. However, the TDM exception, I would say it's fourth most debated topic in the Parliament and the Council, after these big things of cross-border access, value gap publishers, then comes TDM. And the core element which is being debated are indeed beneficiaries. Is it the right approach to limit to beneficiaries? And here also there are some who want to limit more, who want to see that only those research organizations, universities, libraries who do it for non-commercial purposes, so they never get any value out of it, should be covered. And there are others who look at it more liberal and say, actually, there is a readiness to extend this TDM exception and to cover also say either non-profit organizations, also individuals, or some say liberal green members would even say like anybody, so anybody could be able to do text and data mining. Here, of course, this is like political argument, political debate. Do a couple of words of caution. If I mention that there is like a good functioning market for licenses, and if suddenly beneficiaries become everybody, so it means that the publishers, others lose some type of income, which they are able to collect today, say from pharmaceutical companies, which rely a lot, from various advertisement entities, etc. They lose type of income. What does it mean? That it could be that subscription fees would rise for everyone, including for those who don't do TDM, because they will need somehow to recuperate the investment and to collect that money. So always there is like balancing, there is balancing for everything. So like Commission put on the table the balanced proposal in our view, which like correctly responds to market realities and needs, while others in the Parliament think that there is need to do more. And we're happy to follow that debate, to give input and to participate into that. And it also would become clearer in the upcoming months what would be political agreement about that safe landing space, which we hope would be reasonable, but also would not distort the balance in the market. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone? I have a question. First is for Sebastian. You were talking about multi-territorial licenses. Can you tell us a bit more if you know that any multi-territorial license has been granted and who can grant and how this works?
Sure. So multi-territorial licensing is being practiced by a couple of licensing entities. Already before the directive entered into force, Ammonia, a European licensing initiative by several CMOs, has started to operate, and there's some hub developments in that respect. That's happening. I think what's interesting to think about it in terms of multi-territorial licensing in respect of music, so the ultimate goal obviously is by facilitating multi-territorial licenses, reducing transaction costs, we would have easier access to music everywhere. Truth being told though, I mean, it's only been addressed on the collective management side for author rights. And the example that I came with from Skam, the Norwegian TV series, that's actually the negotiation broke there on the other side, because in music many right holders are involved. So I understand that it has been primarily looked at from a collective management organization's point of view, but this is just one side of the multi-territorial licensing. There might be other forms to facilitate that more.
Advantages, the obvious advantages of this multi-territorial licenses, for example, for right holders, are there any advantages or for users, or who would benefit more from these multi-territorial licenses? Because it's always somebody who has more benefits.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, multi-territorial licensing, in the end of the day, the biggest issue when you have mass transactions in copyright is transaction costs. And that's an issue both for right holders, but also users, and users in that respect being commercial users, licensees, and ultimately consumers, of course. So I think it is actually an advantage for both sides, right? maybe Vita also wants to add the Commission perspective on that. But
because right now it has, in the past, it has to go to, if somebody wants to use the content, it has to go in each member state to obtain the licenses and
exactly right. And
so
I think also
a lot of resources.
Yeah. And I think the historical dimension, that's why I had kind of the historical things in there as well. So traditionally we actually had a situation where we could license multi-repertoire in a specific country, right? And by putting the competition concerns very up high on the agenda, this traditional arrangements broke up and kind of made this very problematic interim period for about 10 years until the CM directive now came, where licensing actually has been quite cumbersome and a lot of transaction costs have occurred. And the hope obviously is that this is now being reduced. I think also the interesting thing is that some of the side effects have been functional collaboration. So you would see that now you have shared back offices on many of the CMOs, working places and shared licenses, etc.
They function like collective management bodies, and I think last night you were saying that there are some collective management bodies that grant this kind of license in EK or currently, or do you know where they're based or?
Well, so Ammonia, the biggest one, is a collaboration of several CMOs. STIM, GEMA, PRS also are collaborating on licensing hubs. I think actually our discussion yesterday was more among IMEs. So the directive also introduced a new form of licensing entities, independent management entities, which I think took many by surprise in industry and research, because it's actually not something we've seen before. I think it was meant to address some of the issues of the customized licensing entities addressing multi-territory but mono-repertoire licensors, but actually didn't. And there's some emerging in the UK, and actually Annika also has an example, or several examples from Hungary on that.
Thank you. Annika, you were telling us about the extended licenses. Sorry. Do you have
I have a question because this is something that you said it was very interesting when you began to say that there parallel between freedom of movement and movement of people, and then you were talking about movement of content. And we were considering this because there is something that really does not compute in terms of competition, because we also talk about competition. Now, the proposal, and we are not talking about whether or not the proposal is right, but the proposal talks about temporary, and we discuss a lot what temporary means. Now, don't you think that it is somewhat strange as an academic that we are considering this from the point of view of temporary and not from the point of view of the consumer at large? Because if you take away the temporary and you just have a full portability, because people move, you cannot, they are trying to prevent us from moving from one country to another one, but we can still move more or less freely without the European Union. Content can be blocked. They can block the content, they can block the people. But if you have now a content that can be freely, because with the internet, no matter what, and no matter where, you can access. Now, why the temporary? Why the temporary exception? What are they afraid of? That if I take my subscription in Italy, and then I go in Germany, and I stay in Germany too much, then what happens? What is happening? That I'm depriving the German company for the money? Aren't we a common? If you're in the United States and you buy a subscription to Comcast or to whatever it is, whether you are in California or New York, the access fee is exactly the same. It does not change. And you can go wherever you want in the United States and you can always access. So why do we have a single market and supposedly we should be all the same, and yes, we have this temporary exception? Because if you open this, then what will happen? It will happen like in the competition, the market regulates itself. If in Germany you pay too much and in Italy you pay less, people will come to Italy, we take, and after a while, what will happen? It will be that the market will adjust itself. And so you will have a common approach. As an academic, what do you think of that?
Thank you for a really interesting question. I come with my point of view for a second, and then I actually think also Vita should have the chance to answer because she was working on the proposal. So absolutely, I agree. The temporary aspect has been problematic. The definition has been problematic. What does it mean? How long does it stretch? At the same time, actually, I think it makes, from a systematic point of view, sense to have two different ways of addressing that, and that's why I also tried. I mean, this analogy to free movement of consumer and free movement of service is dangerous because it doesn't really work, but it still kind of gives, I think, a good idea of what are the different angles we're looking at. And if we take the flip side, actually, if we would have the free movement of the service in that respect, then some of the portability issues might be solved as well, right? So there is an interrelation between those. Obviously, the temporarily aspect, I mean, for me it's mostly surprising. There has been a lot of debates on how to define that in detail. Does it entail Erasmus students that are traveling for 3 months or whatever? I think the proposal is such a neat legal model of how addressing these issues, and shows a way of how we can reconcile the digital single market with territorial exploitation in a way. But it's also very restricted. I think that's important to note, right? Portability is not something, I mean, we are all in this room traveling a lot, I guess, and moving across borders, but that's not reality. It's actually only a small percentage of the EU population that's doing that. And with roaming, I mean, the connection with the roaming charges, it makes sense to do it that way. But I think actually the way more important debate should be in the geo-blocking aspect. And there the proposal, I don't know whether some of you read, the Commission's proposal actually laid out by saying, well, copyright is excluded for now, not as regards to interface. You can go on Spotify and see the cheap prices somewhere else, but you can't access it. And the Parliament now is actually discussing whether to expand it or not, and there might be some changes there. But that's also why I wanted to draw your attention to competition law, because, I mean, I don't expect much more to happen in copyright for a long time after we have had those packages through. So if those questions remain unanswered, I think the digital single market might be actually addressed via both the Court of Justice and using competition law to make some of these things happen that have now been not sufficiently addressed to make the digital single, or make copyright fit for the digital single market.
Thanks a lot for the question. I would like to add on it. You asked why temporary, right? Why portability? Why this our right to travel with our content is temporary? Look at it that regulation, which is, by the way, not proposal anymore, it's been adopted on 14th of June. The regulation is having very specific targeted objective, right? To help people in those situations where they are indeed temporarily abroad to continue enjoying their content. And to know why is that? Because it's quite unique. Because what it says is that service provider doesn't need licenses for other territories, and consumer doesn't need to pay anything extra for that. There is like specifically prohibited that consumer should not pay anything extra for that, full stop. So like imagine situation we say, okay, it's not temporary, it's forever. So how do you imagine, that say Lithuanian service provider forever gives services to people in Germany, but without paying license? It doesn't seem right, no? I suppose as you are IP lawyers could say, yes, you need to pay for the rights, for the territories which you use, The number of audience differs in member state. For example, Maltese audience is much smaller than the UK audience, etc. So of course there is, and we are giving, it's like a bit giving to consumers, giving to service provider framework, and of course there should be limit because there is no extra price in that. When we're speaking of, and this is why temporary, and by the way, temporary is defined as wide as possible notion because the regulation specifically prohibits for service providers and right holders, and for service providers and consumers to agree on any specific period of time. So it means that as long as consumer remains resident of that member state, as long as he is or she is temporarily elsewhere, doesn't move residence, and as long as the verification which is done by service provider is positive, the consumer enjoys. So it cannot be set 5 days, 1 week, or 30 days. That's specifically excluded. Then we are looking to this other proposal, geo-blocking, which under the Commission proposal doesn't concern any copyrighted works. The Parliament suggested to extend it to non-audiovisual copyrighted works. But here there is very clear requirement. Service provider needs to have a license for those territories before applying to requests by consumers. So it's not saying geo-blocking is removed and this is it, no service providers buy for small territory and they can do for the rest. No, they need to have license. And of course, if you need to have license, then you don't limit to temporary, you don't balance, you don't do verification, because you need to pay for that. So it's like a big difference, right, in a step. Portability, as also Sebastian said, it's a unique instrument in a way that it, like, by legal fiction and by special safeguards, like removes those situations from national framework, but still says, let's assume that everything is still happening nationally in that member state. Though it doesn't close the gate. If service provider is ready to go to few territories, they go to few territories. If service provider is ready to cover all EU, they cover all EU. So a bit to answer to that question, I hope it a bit clarifies. Yes, thank you.
I am Luis Alfonso Duran from Spain. I have a question concerning this issue you are discussing. Why you don't apply the principle of exhaustion of rights that you apply in other areas like patents or trademarks? Because if I buy a book in Spain, I can read it in Budapest because I have acquired, and buying a book is buying a license because I don't own the book. It's a kind of license. So, yeah, but I mean, but I mean, it's also copyright in books. So why you do not apply this principle of exhaustion of rights?
Very brief and simple to the point. There is like difference between, say, physical goods here, in my personal view, and digital services, etc., or digital goods. Give me an analogy, like about parallel trade and exhaustion, say handbags with famous trademark. See, I bought 50 handbags. I bought them 50 physically, and even if I sell across Europe, I don't have suddenly 500 handbags. I just have still 50. So one I sell in Germany, one I sell in Belgium, one I keep here in Hungary, and I still have 50. About digital services, etc., I know they multiply. Like one, if I take license for Hungary, I may have up to certain level of users. But if I sort of say, oh, this is exhausted, now I can do in entire Europe. So suddenly, instead of say 1 million users, I have like 28 million users. So it's like completely different for digital services because they are like copies are, can be multiplied to infinitum. So this is why it's still a bit different where you exhaust like copyright digital services online as compared to goods marked by trademarks. I don't know if Sebastian or somebody else want to add?
Yeah, maybe just briefly adding a thought. I like your question, and it leads to the very basic of the question: how do we translate copyright into the digital age? And surprising, we still aren't quite there yet, right? If I just come with another analogy, I think if we think about software nowadays, everything is moving to software as a service to subscription. If we think about online content, everything is moving to subscription. The music numbers from Norway and Denmark are really staggering and show that. So this whole contractual relation between the content and the user is fairly new and coming into that. And I think that's where suddenly this consumer perspective comes into copyright, and where this consumer protection rationale maybe as well comes in. That might be interesting in looking at those contracts. And I mean, exhaustion has been debated a lot in terms of software, right? But with the move of having this contractual relationship, I think there needs to be other ways of balancing that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to address one more question to Vita and one has to Aniko. What would be the difference between the cross-portability regulation for online content and the other one, which is the proposal for accessibility of TV and radio online content? So if we have the regulation for the cross-border portability, why do we need the other one?
Thank you very much. Very good question, which also would help to answer some other questions which were raised and to clarify objectives of these two instruments. So indeed, as in reply to your question, I was like saying that the whole purpose of portability is to allow the consumer who has already a contract in his or her member state to move around with that content when he or she travels in Europe. So like objective very simple, so consumer goes, subscribes in this country, and then travels with that content. And in terms of that proposal, and by the way, to add that this cross-border portability of services covers all type of copyrighted services and much more, because it covers also all audiovisual media services, even if they are not copyrighted, for example, sporting events, political debates, etc. And all broadcasts of TV and radio, so it's like a bit wider. When that regulation, which is still at the proposal stage, which aims to ensure, actually is to ensure to help cross-border access. So basically it's about Hungarian consumer who actually opens up a TV palette which is available through satellite and cable and still sees that he or she is not satisfied what they have there, that they want to see more, for example, programs from Germany, France, etc. online across borders. So it's not like buying in his or her country, but like to have possibility, opportunity to watch online services or to listen to online radio from other member states. And here actually we also have some data that demand is not being satisfied through traditional TV means because, for example, now in 2015 there were 316 TV channels established in Germany, and from those only one is available in Spain through traditional TV means such as cable, IPTV or terrestrial, and 3 in Sweden. And for example, out of 44 Hungarian channels, only 1 is available in Germany, but none in France or Poland. So that demand of curious Europeans who want to see more is not satisfied, when sometimes there is no reason really to geo-block. So the idea of that proposal is actually to expand a bit that sort of broadcasters to create incentive that they make their online services available elsewhere. Whether they take fee or not, it's up to them. And they are not forced, but at least they have like a bit push incentive to do it because the licensing of rights would be so much easier for them in order to achieve that. And why there's no obligation? Because if like another instrument, geo-blocking, creates obligation, there would be no obligation under that TV radio proposal, because broadcasters, not all of them have financial means to buy licenses for all Europe. So if you would force small, say, private Hungarian broadcaster to serve entire Europe, they would not anymore be able to buy films or other premium content, because the license fees would jump to meet the audience of Europe. So that is enabling. Portability is obliging, but for different purpose.
The last question for Anniko, but just briefly, if you can give a few details about what this extended licenses refer to.
Thank you. Extended licensing system is a principle of the Hungarian copyright law, which says that a registered collective rights management organization, which is an association of the authors or performing artists or other right holders, is entitled to represent not only the members of the association, of the organization, but everybody else in the same right holder group. It's fixed in the law, in the copyright law, and it makes possible an easy licensing for the users and a safety on the side of the right holders, because everybody is represented by the CMO. In the Copyright Act, before the CMO directive, it should apply to all collective rights management organizations, because all of them were registered organizations, all of them were associations of the right holders, so non-profit associations. After the implementation of the directive, it has to be changed because this extended licensing power belongs to the representative CMOs. We can create a new CMO with 3 right holders. It's not a representative CMO of the Hungarian composers, of course. This small CMO isn't entitled to extended licensing, of course. But if a CMO is representative, so it represents a relevant number of the right holders group, it will be entitled for extended licensing.
Very much. I think we have reached to the end of our session. Thank you very much for being here with us, and thank you for the audience for remaining with us. Well, I wish you a very good lunch, and thank you very much.